Welcome to the Floodgate podcast. I'm your host for this episode, Robert Inlakesh. Today we speak to author and anti-fascist activist Tony Greenstein, focusing on Israel and the far right, the Zionist attempt to win what's being called the Maga Civil War, and much more. To kickstart this off, I know there's a few questions you had about a recent article that I wrote, and perhaps there's an important discussion about it that we can get into, and I really want to get into that. But I wanted to start off with your book, your latest book, Zionism During the Holocaust, the Weaponization of Memory in the Service of State and Nation. Regarding chapter 16 of your book, which is entitled Israel's Relationship with the Far Right, you open that chapter of the book with, quote, "Proponents of the new anti-Semitism rest their arguments on the assumption that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are identical. Anti-Zionism, it is argued, is merely the flag under which anti-Semitism flies, whereas the opposite is in fact the case. It is support for Israel and Zionism which has enabled anti-Semites to disguise or kosher their anti-Semitism." I'd like for you, in the spirit of this discussion, to elaborate on that. I know you do in your book and you give examples, but this question specifically about Israel and its relationship with the far right, I think is of huge importance, not only to our viewers here, but the wider public. So if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, we see repeatedly people who are anti-Semitic, it being said of them, they are pro-Israel, and therefore that excuses them, despite the fact that when it comes to Jews as individuals, they're as atrocious as any common and garden anti-Semite would be. I mean, the worst example is, which I give in chapter 18, the Argentinian junta between 1976 and 83. It was a neo-Nazi junta. It killed up to 3,000 Jews who died. There were part of those who disappeared. Up to something like 12.5% of all those who were murdered by the junta were Jewish. But Israel had a very close relationship with that junta. It supplied them with over $1 billion of arms. It was a major resupplier during the Falklands War with Britain. And when right-wing neocons and Zionists in America were facing criticism of Argentina, indeed attempts, which in fact I think were successful, to stop US arms supply to Argentina, they turned around and said, well, the junta can't be anti-Semitic because it supports Israel, despite the fact that it persecuted Jewish people. So I think we have to understand that phenomenon. It's the same today. I mean, Viktor Orban, you described Admiral Hawthey, who presided over the deportation of nearly 500,000 Jews to Auschwitz, as an exceptional statesman. Yet he has a very close relationship and gives unstinting support to Israel during its genocide. So we see this time and time again, and the answer may be, why is this so? Why historically have anti-Semites supported Zionism? And it's not difficult to understand. The anti-Semites wanted Jews out of the places they were living, and the Zionists said, we're only too happy to go. It was even worse than that. I mean, the Zionists actually expressed an understanding for why they were anti-Semitic, because, of course, Jews, in the words of one Zionist, a novelist, A.B. Yehoshua, said they were like guests who'd outstayed their welcome in the hotels. So, I mean, Zionism and anti-Semitism have always been two sides of the same coin.
And that leads me to my next question, which is actually the next chapter of your book, where you address the topic of the world Jewish conspiracy has been replaced by the global Islamic conspiracy. Now, during the War on Terror, these arguments came to the forefront, and as a Muslim myself, I couldn't help but see the parallels between these anti-Semitic far-right arguments that were made and that we all learned about, of course, which led to pogroms and, of course, the Holocaust. And the anti-Muslim narratives that were being spread. Particularly, you could pin that down to the likes of maybe the David Horowitz Freedom Center and some of these very far-right Zionist billionaires. But across the spectrum, this was obviously, it was very popular to sort of bash on Muslims in this way and go after Muslims. Could you elaborate on that little bit, that topic about those parallels between the two and how, we've now transferred from the right talking about a global, Jewish conspiracy to the Muslim conspiracy and Islamic takeover?
Yeah, I mean, of course, they're not exact parallels in the sense that the world Jewish conspiracy had Jews controlling the world through their financial networks and so on, whereas with Muslims, it's not of that nature. But given that Muslims in both the United States and in Europe are the target for racists and ruling elites, then it's clear that they are taking the place that Jews previously occupied in the 1930s. They are the major scapegoats, and of course, Zionism uh, has aided and abetted that every step of the way. We've just seen the Israeli government officially invite Tommy Robinson, who's a British fascist. I don't know whether you've heard of him, but uh, to be a guest to the Israeli government. And he's the number one, if you like, Islamophobe in Britain. So, given that Israel, when it attacks the Palestinians, usually does that by demonizing Islam, and of course, we know about the Al Aqsa Mosque, where you have settlers invaded, etc. Uh, Muslims are demonized in Israel. There are laws against sounding, I think, the horn or the call to prayer early in the morning now, and so on. Uh, it's no surprise that there's a tie-up between Islamophobes in the West and Zionism. People like Geert Wilders, for example, who says that Jerusalem is the frontier for civilization against the barbaric hordes of Islam. So, I mean, then we see the construction of a kind of false fake history, uh, the Judeo-Christian heritage, for example, uh, which is a total utter myth. I mean, you look into Jewish history. I mean, there are periodic massacres, the Chmielnicki pogroms in Poland, and of course, culminating in the Holocaust itself. Uh, there's no equivalent in Arabia, although the Zionists look for every instance of a pogrom or disturbance in the Arab world in order to prove that the Arab world was as hostile to Jews as Europe. We know that that's not the case. I mean, there was the Farhud in Iraq when about 150 Jews died in 1941 after a coup against the British was defeated. Uh, but even then, I mean, many Jews were saved by their Muslim neighbors. But Zionism, if you like, because it's a sectarian political movement that uses religion as its cover and guise, has focused on Islam uh, and demonized Muslims, and that fits in very well with the predominant racism in Europe. So you cited the David Horowitz Center. I mean, but you look at all the primary Islamophobes in the United States. They're all pro-Zionists, starting with Trump and Jared Kushner, and so on, right down. So it's just a fit today that if you're on the far right, you'll be pro-Zionist and anti-Islam or anti-Muslim, I mean, to be more precise.
And I think that sort of leads into the conversation, which I was hoping to have with you on some of your comments to do with a piece that I wrote, which was about Nick Fuentes and this sort of split in the MAGA movement, the MAGA Civil War, as it's being called, in the United States. And I think something that perhaps you had either taken issue with or needed me to clear up something on was that I said that many of these figures on the US right seem to have forgotten that they're Jewish in the direction of their coverage. And of course, by that, I didn't necessarily mean that they don't know what they're doing. I think that they do very much know what they're doing and who their messaging is seeking to reach. However, what I would argue, and I don't think I put this through in my article clear enough, was is the fact that the natural conclusion of the ideology that the likes of a Ben Shapiro or those who are a bit more extreme, like Laura Loomer, put forth, the natural conclusion of that is to include all minority groups, not just we hate black people and or we talk against black people, we hate Muslims and clash of civilization and hold those Muslim barbarians at the door. That naturally that ideology, that right-wing ideology, and these people with such a far right mentality, especially in the context of this culture war, which was all based on identity. There wasn't really talk about capitalism and socialism unless they were used as slurs against the other side. It was all identity. And so on the right, the likes of Ben Shapiro or Laura Loomer were talking essentially to white identity. But they would leave out anything critical of Jewish people. And historically speaking, movements like these, who are hyper focused on white identity, are hypercritical of every single minority community, have always been hostile to Jewish people. And now, in my opinion, it's not so surprising that people have come along, especially because of what has happened in Gaza. I think it's changed the political climate in the United States to such a degree now. People are starting to become critical of the Israel lobby. And on the right, they care less about, I'd say, human rights concerns with the Palestinians, although I'm not saying that right-wingers can't care about human rights, but they're less concerned with the Palestinians and more concerned perhaps with how does Israel's policy and foreign policy, how does the Israel lobby affect Americans? How are American taxpayer dollars used? And then that ends up translating in this environment of such an identitarian based discourse. It translates into, yeah, and also screw the Jews. Yeah, screw the Muslims, screw Mexicans and immigrants and everyone else, but also the Jews. And that's, I think, what I was trying to put forth. And I would honestly, I'm interested to hear your comments on that. And perhaps I've cleared up what the point was that I was trying to make there.
Yeah, I mean, I understood a kind of different point, which was that you were commenting that Israel itself was aligning with people who are anti-Semitic, despite the fact that it says it's concerned with anti-Semitism. I think it's a different phenomena in a sense. If you're looking at it from the perspective of those within MAGA who are beginning to question the United States support for Zionism and Israel. Uh, I'm not convinced that they will break the mold inside MAGA. I mean, I think maybe other things will, like the fact that Trump is impoverishing a large number of his erstwhile supporters through tariffs, Medicaid, and so on. But yes, there's always a danger that certainly for those on the right who identify Israel with Jews, if they turn against Israel, they'll turn against Jews. Uh, my take on that is I don't have a lot in common with them anyway, but Jewish people should wise up and realize that the right is not and never has been your friend. And they themselves should break from Zionism. And if they don't break from Zionism, they cannot complain that the anti-Semites they've been pally with are now turning against them.
And one thing that I think we've all witnessed is that while Israel in the past, obviously putting aside the revisionist Zionist strain, when Israel first came about after the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and declared itself a state, they built things like the Histadrut, kibbutzim, and they came with a lot of what they would have argued are socialist ideas and leftist ideals. Obviously, what we've seen is that Israel has shifted away from that, and we have more religious nationalism now. I'm not arguing, of course, that these right-wing tendencies have not been there from the start. That would be naive. However, there still was a segment of the Israeli leadership and Israeli society at some point that tried to appeal to left-leaning or centrists in the West, tried to speak their language, knew how to speak to them, and knew their sensibilities. But it does seem like now the Israelis have put all their eggs in one basket with the right. They've completely lost anyone who identifies as liberal or left wing in any way, because nobody can stomach what is being done to the people of Gaza. And also, they can't stomach their language and their political alignments as well. Um, do you think that that was a strategic mistake for the Israelis? Because right now they're trying to salvage that rapid loss of support from US conservatives, specifically amongst people under the age of 50 in the United States who are Republican Party voters. Around half of them said that they have negative attitudes towards Israel. Obviously, it's impossible to predict whether that will hold out. But we do see that that anti-Israel trend is growing. And that has translated ultimately to an anti-Jewish trend as well, amongst segments of the right in the United States. What do you think about that and the direction that Israel has sort of taken its foreign policy and
Well,
propaganda?
first we have to, if you like, go back into the history of Zionism. I mean, you said Histadrut came about after after the Nakba, but in fact it was formed in 1920, and it was
Yeah.
formed as a Jewish-only trade union. In fact, not even a trade union. Golda Meir, I think, or yeah, Golda Meir called it a general colonizing agency, which is the best description. It was also the largest employer by the state and Israel itself. Uh, the strategy of Zionism at that time, because it was building up the state, was collective colonization. And
Hmm.
the guy who supported that most of all was Arthur Rupin, who was a right wing Zionist. He was director of the Palestine office in Jaffa from 1908. Uh, but it was more efficient and cheaper to colonize collectively than individually. Also, the kibbutzim were the stockade and watchtower settlements, so they marked the border of where the Zionists wanted to expand to. Uh, and yes, they appealed to, for instance, the Labour Party in Britain because they spoke the language of social democracy. But as Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, the second president, said, whenever there's a conflict between our socialism and our nationalism, our Zionism, the Zionism wins out because they wanted a Jewish state. And the Jewish state meant as few Arabs as possible. So they were much more efficient, of course, at Hasbara, the Israeli word for propaganda. They were able to put over. I mean, when I grew up as a Zionist in a Zionist family, and I was taught to see Israel as the kind of oasis of socialism amidst the Arab barbarians, if you like. The Arabs didn't want peace, we wanted it, and so on. The Nakba, of course, was never talked about. It was the Arab refugees ran away to let the Arab armies in. But within Israel, if you like, there was always, being a settler colonial state, an inherent tendency towards expansion. And it was Ben Gurion, the atheist, who held Bible lessons because the Bible was the blueprint for the conquering and achievements of the greater Israel. I mean, the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, is not the state of Israel's borders. At its maximum, it goes from the Litani in Lebanon across to the Euphrates in Iraq and down to the Nile in Egypt. So there's plenty of room for expansion. And the Bible gives a legitimacy to that inherent expansionism in settler colonialism. Uh, and so it's not surprising that when the West Bank, in particular in Gaza, were conquered in 1967, that the fundamentalist settlers who went there were imbued with this ideology of the greater Israel and the Bible. And they were religious nationalists, certainly, but actually the people who supported them were the so-called left in Mapai, the Israeli Labour Party, Yitzhak Tepenkin, Yigal Alon, Yisrael Galili. They were part of the Greater Israel movement at that time. So you had that symbiotic relationship between what was left of Labour Zionism, because it was even then beginning to decline, and the new, if you like, movement of the right. Now, I mean, Likud, of course, gave support to the colonial expansion in the West Bank. Uh, and as that grew, its political weight grew. So much so that today the settler right dominate the Israeli government. And the whole pendulum has swung in Israel to, if like, an openly genocidal and exterminationist and racist mentality. So you have a creature like Ben Gavir, who has on his wall, or did have, Baruch Goldstein, the mass murderer in Hebron, for example. So today, you can't, ideology and material reality have to catch up with each other. Yeah, I mean, for a long time, the Israeli Labour Party portrayed Israel as the land of equality between Arabs and Jews. After all, Arabs could vote. I mean, very few people in the West knew about the inherent discrimination within Israel against Arabs, or the fact that they were living under military domination, or the fact that only 2% of the land was allocated to 20% of the population, or all the other things. Kafar Qasem wasn't mentioned, and so on. But today, of course, the right are open about it. They chant death to the Arabs. That was a relatively recent slogan.
Mhm.
So although Israel was racist under the Israeli Labour Party, it wasn't that apparent. But when I went, I've only been once in 1969, it was apparent to me that Israel was an incredibly racist society. And the Labour Zionists were just as racist, but are also elitist or racist towards the Mizrahi Jews. And it was the Arab Jews who came from Iraq, Egypt, and so on. And it was they who provided the bulk of support for Menachem Begin. So today we're seeing, if you like, the culmination of Zionism. It began as an idea that Jews would have a refuge, although in practice that was never the case. But today it's an openly Jewish supremacist state, and they proudly proclaim it. Uh, and they have all these genocidal statements that they keep coming out with. I mean, I think South Africa found 500 for the International Court of Justice. They can't help themselves. Uh, I mean, you have people on their television openly proclaiming the need to exterminate every single person in Gaza, for example. I mean, the Labour Zionists were cleverer. They were more adept. They had the Abay and Abba Eban as their foreign secretary, rather than Israel Katz, who can't string two words together, but is a vicious anti-Arabist. So, I mean, that is a change, but underneath, nothing has really changed.
That's the interesting point here is that, when you have a project like this, which inherently within your ideology is to replace the indigenous population, and that means that you are going to be a right-wing project. Eventually, that's the natural conclusion of the project is to head towards the right. And there is this sort of cloaking. And I remember reading about the Palestine communist movement and the party, which originally was all Jewish at the start, but then obviously the Soviets pressured them to introduce more Arabs into the fold of the party. And that was, obviously part of those debates because they had to effectively say, well, we need to put aside our Zionism. And that was a debate. Are you still a Zionist? Can you be part of this party and be a Zionist? And that caused many fractures and splits. And of course, throughout the 1920s, and then obviously it got worse in 1936. This was a big conversation. I think the fracturing of the communist movement itself is a reflection of the fact that you can't marry these two things. You can't have an anti-racist colonial movement or settler colonial movement. And then what we see today is sort of the product of what a settler colonial movement is always going to be in order to be victorious and to sustain itself as an ethno-supremacist regime. This is where it's got to go. And so obviously now we've seen, and taking sort of up to the modern day a little bit more, this alignment with the right or the far, far right and some of the fringes of the right, and attempting to divert attention from what Israel is doing at this moment to Muslims and, fear-mongering about Islamic terrorism. I believe it can't be a winning strategy. And I believe that simply upon the basis that, like with the ideology of Zionism and where it has inevitably headed, that right-wing ideology that they're tapping into in the West naturally comes to the conclusion that it also dislikes Jews as much as it dislikes Muslims, which I think is something that is quite interesting to look at, but it's also something that is perhaps quite dangerous. And once I remember a conversation with a former leader in the PFLP, and I remember him telling me at one point, and it stuck with me. This was many years ago. He said that one day we'll be the ones fighting against anti-Semitism, and that will be our position when this is all over. And that sort of stuck with me. So I'd like to get your comment on that as well, and whether you see it in the same way as the way that I've just sort of framed it there.
Yeah, yes, I do. I mean, it was actually Primo Levi who described the Palestinians as the Jews of Israel. Uh, and for very good reasons as well, because they are the untermenschen in the same way as Jews were in Germany, for example. But I see Zionism, and I agree with Ilan Pappy on this, that we are seeing the beginning of the end of Zionism. That Zionism cannot continue and Israel cannot continue along the path that it is now taken, which is one of open ethnic cleansing. And just as in Hitler's Germany, if you can't ethnically cleanse a population, then you exterminate them. And
Hmm.
that, in essence, is what Israel's doing in Gaza. Let us be absolutely clear about this. Uh, and Jews who support that in the West, or in some cases, I would suggest almost signing their own death warrants because they're allying with forces which will turn against them sooner or later. So, I mean, Zionism is the biggest disaster Jewish people have ever had. It's brought them no benefits whatsoever. It was late upon the stage and could do nothing regarding the Holocaust itself, but it's mercilessly exploited the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust in order to justify everything it's done in Palestine. And that was really why I wrote my book, because I wanted to destroy some of the myths, such as that the Zionist movement fought the Nazis when it never did. And the record is quite clear. And today, Zionism is an alliance with the far right abroad. I mean, uh, when Amichai Chikli, the diaspora minister, organized his conference on fighting anti-Semitism in March this year, who did he invite? Uh, Leaders and members of the far right parties abroad. I mean, he invited all the anti-Semites. Now, there is a logic to that because if you want to understand anti-Semitism, who better to invite than anti-Semites? But that put off the diaspora uh, organisations, even the ADL, which has turned into an extremely vicious Zion. Well, I mean, it's always been a vicious Zionist group, but it did have pretensions that it was a more general anti-racist organisation. But those pretensions have long since gone. So it is embarrassing for Jews in the diaspora who have, if you like, a schizophrenic approach to politics. That on the one hand, they have their own material interest in where they live, in not seeing an increase in anti-Semitism, and on the other hand, they support Israel, whose barbarism brings opprobrium on their heads because Jews are associated with Israel, if only by default. And the question for us is to try and break it. Now, in America, I mean, what you didn't mention was that younger Jews are becoming much more disillusioned with Israel than the older generation. I think 40% of young people see Israel as an apartheid state. The majority of Jews believe that genocide is what's happening in Gaza. So, although the leaders of the American Jewish organizations, which are thoroughly Zionized, of course, are still wholly committed to Israel, there is a growing disenchantment within the Jewish population, but in particular, its younger element who don't feel any emotional tie to Israel at all.
And that's something as well that it sort of taps into the last question I wanted to ask you, which was regarding a former Obama speechwriter. I'm sure you might have seen her comments, which have recently done the rounds on social media, named Sarah Hurwitz. And
Mm.
she basically argued that because of the fact that Holocaust education was educating the public to the idea that, the oppressed, powerless Jews were being murdered by the big, powerful Nazis, and that, of course, they associated that with the struggle in the United States of African Americans against the United States government. That then translated towards we should side with the Palestinians because, she said these skinny Palestinians who are being murdered by powerful Israel. And on that basis, she's saying that, well, yeah, there's these similarities here that people are seeing, and so maybe we should stop teaching them about the Holocaust or change the way that we're teaching the Holocaust because of this. And I think we've got about 5 minutes left here, so I really want to get your comments on that as we close.
Well, yes, I mean, that is kind of ironic because the Holocaust education has never been about generalizing from the Holocaust and taking any universal lessons. It's always been the primary lesson that the Holocaust organizations convey is that the Holocaust resulted in the establishment of the Israeli state, which isn't true, of course, because colonization started 60 years or so ago before the Holocaust. But I think there's a more general thing which we should make. And when my book it goes into its second edition, because I've signed a contract with Verso, I've done a new chapter on the Holocaust in Gaza. It is that not one single Holocaust memorial organization or institute has come out and spoken clearly about the genocide in Gaza. On the contrary, people like Karen Pollock in Britain, the chief executive of the Holocaust Educational Trust, said it's shameful to compare the Holocaust in Gaza to the Holocaust of Jews. And when the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum put out this really anodyne statement saying never again doesn't just mean never again for Jews, they were deluged with complaints that they were giving sustenance to those who did say there was a Holocaust in Gaza. And so what did they do? They deleted their message and apologized for it and put it online. And so it is absolutely shameful that these organizations, which are supposedly commemorating the memory of the Jewish dead in the Holocaust, have kept absolutely silent, or in the case of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, given support to that genocide. And that shows how bogus and fake all these Holocaust memorial organizations are. Their message is not an anti-racist one. It is a one of support for apartheid in Israel. And all that follows from that.
And I think that to close our discussion, I'd like to have you back on because there's so much about your book which we could get into, and I think there's
Sure.
many different questions that we could expand upon. So I really want to thank you for being here with us today
Thank
on
you.
Palestine
Yeah,
Chronicle.
I'm always happy to do this. So, yeah, thank you once again, Robert.